a 3-foot sword nicknamed the laundry pole versus dual katanas. April 13th, 1612. An isolated island, the most legendary duel in Japanese history. One man would walk away, the other would become immortal. And it all came down to inches. This is the story of the Ōdachi, a sword so massive that samurai couldn't even draw it properly. A weapon that defied logic, broke every rule of practical combat, and yet, in the hands of one master, became absolutely unstoppable. Before we dive into this legendary weapon, if you want more deep dives like this exploring the real history behind Ghost of Yotei, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see what's coming next. Let's dive in. The most famous Ōdachi wielder in history? Sasaki Kojiro, a sword saint, chief weapons master of the Hosokawa clan. A man so skilled he could fight 3 opponents with nothing but a metal fan. His weapon was called Monohoshi Zao, the laundry pole. An Ōdachi with a blade measuring over 35 inches, nearly 50% longer than a standard katana. And he had mastered it to absolute perfection. His signature technique, the Tsubame Gaeshi, the turning swallow cut, could strike at over 200 kilometers per hour, fast enough to catch a bird mid-flight, devastating enough to end any duel in a single blow. On April 13th, 1612, he faced Miyamoto Musashi on Ganryu Island. Musashi would later call him the strongest opponent he ever faced in his entire life. But Musashi won, not through superior technique, through cunning. He arrived late to disrupt Kojiro's mental state, and he carved a wooden sword longer than Kojiro's Ōdachi to negate his reach advantage. The duel lasted seconds. Kojiro's legendary blade missed Musashi's head by inches. Musashi's Bakken didn't miss. That's the paradox of the Ōdachi. Even in the hands of a master, one mistake was all it took. And Kojiro wasn't the only one to wield it. If you think Kojiro's sword was massive, let me introduce you to the Odachi Norimitsu. Forged in August 1446 by the swordsmith Norimitsu Osafune, this blade is one of the longest swords ever created in Japanese history. The total length? 377 centimeters. That's over 12 feet long. The blade alone measured 226.7 centimeters, nearly 7.5 feet of cutting edge. Let that sink in. This wasn't a sword. This was a statement. But here's the thing. The Odachi Norimitsu was never meant for actual combat. It was far too large, far too heavy. Drawing it from a scabbard? Impossible. Wielding it effectively in battle? Absurd. So why make it? It was a ceremonial weapon, a showcase of the swordsmith's incredible skill and craftsmanship. During the Nanboku-cho period in the 14th century, massive swords like this were at their peak popularity, thanks to the nationwide influence of the Soshu school of bladesmithing, which specialized in creating strong, sharp, and often enormous weapons. These giant Ōdachi were offered to Shinto shrines as gifts to the kami, the gods. They were symbols of devotion, power, and artistry. They were meant to be admired, not wielded. But some warriors tried anyway. Historical records mention a few extraordinarily strong samurai who used oversized Ōdachi in battle, primarily as anti-cavalry weapons. Picture this. An enemy-mounted unit charges at full speed. A normal katana doesn't have the reach to strike the horse before the rider is on top of you. But an Ōdachi? You could cut down the horse mid-charge, bringing rider and mount crashing to the ground before they ever closed the distance. It was devastatingly effective in the right hands. The problem? Very few hands were right for it. Only the most powerful warriors, men with extraordinary strength, stamina, and skill, could use an Ōdachi in actual combat. And even then, it required specific battlefield conditions, open terrain, room to maneuver, and preferably opponents on horseback. The Odachi Norimitsu stands today as a relic of that era, a reminder that sometimes the greatest weapons aren't the most practical ones. They're the ones that push the limits of what's possible. So, what exactly is an Odachi? Let's break down the name first. The character O means big or great. Dachi is the voiced version of Tachi, which means great sword. So Odachi literally translates to great sword or large sword. But you've probably also heard it called a Nodachi. Same weapon, slightly different name. No means field. So Nodachi means field sword, a weapon of the battlefield. According to the historical text, Wakan Shuyo, a Nodachi had a blade length of approximately 148 centimeters, while an Odachi measured around 125 centimeters. But the terms were often used interchangeably. To officially qualify as an Odachi, the blade needed to be at least 3 shaku. That's about 90.9 centimeters or roughly 35 inches. Compare that to a standard katana, which typically has a blade length of 60 to 70 centimeters. The Odachi was significantly longer, heavier, and far more difficult to control. The weapon first appeared during the Heian Period in the 5th century. Archaeologists excavated a large sword measuring 117 centimeters from an ancient burial mound in Kumamoto, proving that oversized blades existed in Japan far earlier than most people realize. But the Odachi truly rose to prominence during the Nanboku-cho period in the 14th century. This was the golden age of massive Japanese swords, driven by the influence of the Soshu school, which perfected the art of forging long, razor-sharp blades. Historians believe Japanese swordsmiths were inspired by similar large-bladed weapons from China, particularly the Zhanmadao, an anti-cavalry sword used during the Song dynasty. The concept was the same: create a blade long enough to strike down horses and riders from a distance. The Odachi became a weapon of the field, hence the name Nodachi. It was designed for open combat, particularly against mounted opponents. If a cavalry charge was bearing down on you, the Odachi's reach gave you a critical advantage. You could strike the horse as it approached, keeping the enemy at bay while your allies closed in. But there was a problem, a big one. The Odachi was different from every other Japanese sword in one critical way. You couldn't draw it. Because the blade was often 150 centimeters or longer, it was physically impossible to draw from a scabbard worn at the waist like a normal katana. So how did samurai carry it? Some wore it slung across their backs, but even then, drawing it quickly was out of the question. Most warriors carried the sword in its sheath in their hands, or, if they were wealthy enough, had a servant follow them specifically to draw the blade when needed. Imagine that. You're walking into battle, and you need a second person just to hand you your weapon. Manufacturing an Odachi was also exponentially harder than forging a standard katana. The sheer size required far more raw materials, more steel, more time, more precision. Differential heat treatment, which gives Japanese swords their signature hardness and flexibility, became a logistical nightmare with a blade this large. Bladesmiths needed access to massive pools of water or oil for quenching, something not every forge had. And then there's the polishing. Polishing a katana is already an art form that takes years to master. Polishing an Odachi? It had to be suspended from the ceiling or hung from a tall structure because it was too large to run across traditional polishing stones. The process was painstaking, expensive, and time-consuming. All of this made the Odachi incredibly rare. But rarity wasn't just about difficulty. It was about practicality, or rather, the lack of it. As warfare evolved, the Odachi became obsolete. During the Sengoku period, battles shifted toward large-scale infantry combat with yari, spears, and tanegashima, early firearms. Huge numbers of Ashigaru foot soldiers armed with polearms and guns changed the nature of warfare entirely. The Odachi was a specialist weapon. It excelled in specific situations: open battlefields, anti-cavalry operations, duels with plenty of space. But in mountain terrain, surprise attacks, or densely packed infantry formations, it was a liability. And after the siege of Osaka in the early 1600s, the Tokugawa shogunate enacted strict laws prohibiting the ownership and carrying of long swords. Many Ōdachi were literally cut down to legal lengths, their blades shortened to meet the new regulations. By the peaceful Edo period, the Ōdachi was no longer seen as a practical weapon. It transitioned into a ceremonial object, something offered to shrines, displayed as art, or kept as a symbol of a warrior's legacy. It became a relic of a bygone era. So who was the perfect user for an Ōdachi? Physically, you needed exceptional strength and stamina. This wasn't a weapon you could casually swing around. It required someone tall with the leverage to control a blade that long without sacrificing speed or precision. Tactically, you needed the right environment: open battlefields, one-on-one duels, anti-cavalry operations, situations where reach was your greatest asset. In confined spaces, castle corridors, dense forests, crowded streets, the Ōdachi became a hindrance. But most importantly, you needed skill, mastery-level swordsmanship to compensate for the weapon's weight and recovery time, precise timing to land devastating blows despite the slower draw speed, and a strategic mind to exploit the reach advantage while minimizing exposure during recovery. Only a handful of warriors in Japanese history met all those criteria. Sasaki Kojiro was one of them, and even he fell to a man who understood that strategy, psychology, and adaptation could overcome raw power and technique. In Ghost of Yotei, you can pick up an Ōdachi and wield it like it's nothing. Sweeping strikes, powerful overhead slashes, crowd control with wide arcs. It feels unstoppable. But the reality? The Ōdachi was a weapon that pushed the limits of what a human could achieve with a sword. It was too big to be practical, too rare to be common, and too difficult to master for most warriors. And yet, in the hands of someone like Kojiro, it became legendary. The legacy of the Ōdachi isn't about practicality. It's about the pursuit of mastery. It's about pushing boundaries, defying expectations, and proving that even the most impossible weapon can become unstoppable in the right hands. Sasaki Kojiro proved that, and even in defeat, his legend endures. The Ōdachi is a paradox, a weapon that shouldn't work, but did. A sword too big to draw, but wielded with grace by a select few. A relic of an age where size, skill, and reach could define the outcome of a duel. Sasaki Kojiro's Monohoshi-zao, the Odachi Norimitsu. These weren't just weapons. They were symbols of ambition, of craftsmanship, of the relentless human drive to create something extraordinary, even if it defies all logic. Ghost of Yotei lets us experience that legacy firsthand. And now, you know the real history behind it. What other weapons or stories from Ghost of Yotei should I cover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the way of the Ōdachi, hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more to explore. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.